Part 1. The Rule of St. Benedict compared to Masonic ordinances, monastic lodges, rules of silence and sign language in monastic and Masonic orders. Upon close examination, one finds over a dozen explicit similarities of monasticism and Masonry. In this section, I will be reading selected passages from an article published on Peter Stone's Review of Freemasonry, which is the oldest, most popular, and famous Freemasons online magazine written by Master Masons of a Grand Lodge of ancient accepted Freemasons. At the conclusion of the reading, it will be apparent to the listener that the rules, offices, and practices of Freemasonic organizations derived from the Rule of St. Benedict, a book of precepts written in 516 by Benedict of Nursia for monks living communally under the authority of an abbot, the abbot of the monastery corresponding to the worshipful master within a Masonic lodge. It will also be seen that Catholic monks and priests were very much involved in Masonic lodges in the 18th century in Europe. In fact, many of the lodges that were established at that time were founded within Roman Catholic monasteries. More on this will be discussed later. Three Challenging Similarities: An Exploration of Monastic and Masonic Orders by Brother Karel Muschk of the Middelpunt Lodge 280, Grand East of the Netherlands. Introduction. In this paper, three dimensions of the similarities between monastic and Masonic orders will be explored, concentrating on the Rule of St. Benedict. In the Transactions of the Lodge Quatuor Quaranti 1, Brother Woodward reminds us of, quote, the suggestions made at various times of a knightly, a Benedictine, or a monastic, unquote, origin. I tried to find the earlier material on which Brother Woodward could have based this statement, but did not succeed. However, I would like to share with you the material which did prove to exist in an accessible way. This paper deals very briefly and mainly in an introductory sense with monastic orders in general, and gives some insights in Benedict and his rule. Then, the three dimensions of the similarities between monastic and Masonic orders will be analyzed. Firstly, the similarities of the rule and the ritual will be addressed. Secondly, some material will be presented on lodges founded in monasteries. Thirdly, a very modest paragraph will mention sign language. Monastic orders. Christian monasticism, as we came to know it, was born in Africa in the Middle East. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the phenomenon came to Europe, from what we now call Egypt and Syria. The first rule of monasticism we know about is the one of Pacon, written about 320 AD. What can be considered the Rule of Augustine dates from 390 AD. The origins of monasticism lie in the desert and in asceticism. In his introduction to a recent Dutch translation of the Rule of Augustine, Professor Fens reminds us that probably the most strict monastery on earth, La Grande Châteauroux near Grenoble, is still called the desert. Monasteries were centers of civilization, far from peopled by backwards monks who were busy burning books and heretics. On the contrary, monasteries were organizing schools, agricultural development, administration of justice, and the development of science. The innovation of religion started in monasteries. Erasmus and Luther were monks. It is significant that the Church tolerated the monasteries in such a way that monasticism did not disengage itself from the Church. Escaping from the world to follow, to imitate the strict words of Christ, was and still is one of the fundaments of monasticism. It can be considered a protest against the secularization of Christendom, according to the German theologian Bonhoeffer. Monasticism was not only a protest, it was gradually becoming an alibi for Christianity, because monasteries were keeping the grace alive on the fringe of the Church. It was the special performance of the few that enabled the mass to go on with their daily business. The more the profane power and economics influenced monasticism, the more religious influence waned, including the erosion of asceticism. The history of monastic orders is littered by examples of the growing worldly power in the monastery going hand in hand with diminishing religious authority. The more influential monasteries became in the worldly sense, the more subject they became to the rules of the worldly power play. Time and time again, this called for reform movements that wanted to return to the simple ascetic life. Chartreux in reaction to Cluny, Trappists in reaction to Citro. Monasticism is centered about daily rituals, prescribing the time and content of meals, services to be held, songs to be sung, the hours spent studying or working. To some, this seems a monotonous existence, but in essence, monotony frees the mind, allowing it to wander and wander. Monotony is a binding factor in Freemasonry and in monasticism. In Freemasonry, it is called ritual, meaning the same thing. Benedict of Nursia. Born in Nursia, present-day Norcia in Italy, he lived from 480 to 550. He was born into a well-to-do family of landowners. What is known of him comes mostly from one of his monks, who later became Pope Gregory from 590 to 604. Gregory wrote the Dialogues, a book about the lives of Benedict and other saints. The life of Benedict was a bit of a paradox. After he set out to lead an ascetic life as a hermit, he was so successful that he gathered a following, which must be a confusing experience for a hermit, by the way. The master attracted apprentices every time. He started a monastery, went away, started again, the famous Monte Cassino, which was so horribly destroyed by the Americans during World War II and which was later restored. His rule dates from about 530 AD. If the rule of Benedict is compared with other monastic rules, one cannot fail to notice the simplicity and the ease with which he directs monastic life. Some rules, for instance, the Celtic versions, can be very strict and are almost a penal code. The rule of Benedict was one of the most written and read manuscripts in the Middle Ages. His was the most influential rule. That may be well because of the intriguing melange of strictness and forgiveness. Benedict gives very detailed instructions for the daily rituals, including which psalms to sing at which days. In chapter 18, however, he states that, quote, if the distribution is displeasing to anyone, he should arrange them otherwise, unquote. A wise acceptance of differences and changing possibilities. The similarities. In this paragraph, some examples will be given of the rule, relating them to our craft. Bear in mind that it is not primarily the historical or analytical aspects that inspire me, but most of all the spiritual wisdom that speaks through these rules. Number 1. Listening. The first words of the rule are, quote, listen, my son, to your master's precepts, and incline the ear of your heart, unquote. Some older Freemasons in Holland remember with some melancholy the ancient rules in which entered apprentices were supposed to refrain from talking in the lodge. They were supposed to listen to their master until they were considered to have made sufficient progress to be passed. The term used in the original Latin is ausculta. Ausculta means listening with devotion and concentration. This introduction to the rule also illustrates the importance of obedience. Number 2. The vows. The rule knows 3 vows: stabilitas, conversio, and obedientia. Stabilitas means that you have chosen a monastery and you will remain there. It is a question of loyalty to the community, in our case the lodge. People will grow, we each have that capacity, and Benedict is a strong believer in that capacity. But we must grow where we were planted. Faith and being dependable are qualities that flourish in the lodge and that make a lodge flourish. Conversio means that in entering the order, you must be willing to change fundamentally. It is like working in an operating theater. We cannot do that if it is a bit sterile. Neither can one be a bit pregnant, a bit monk, or a bit Freemason. We have our mission, and that is all-consuming. In Dutch ritual, at closing the lodge, we are commanded by our master to go west and make ourselves known as Freemasons, meaning of course that we must act as such. Our master does not invite us to be a Mason, a little bit, but to wholeheartedly do our utmost. The vow of obentia seems to be the hardest of all, at least to some. Promising obedience to the master, as we do, is not an obedience to a person. In that sense, it is not a matter of leadership, but a form of obedience to the chair on which one day we ourselves may be sitting. As we obey our masters, we do not do what we are told, but we do what is necessary. Number 3. The ritual. The rule gives much attention to what we would call the ritual. The day is divided into various parts on the ground of very specific directions, when to do, what to sing. The rhythm in the monastery is determined by the ritual, just as the rhythm of our ritual does in our lodge. Number 4. The abbot. As in lodges, the worshipful master in monasteries, the abbot is the supreme authority. An abbot is chosen from among his brothers, preferably unanimously. He is chosen for his merit of life and wisdom of doctrine. His duty is rather to profit the brothers than to preside over them. He must be learned in the law, that he may have a treasure of knowledge from which to bring forth new things and old. Common sense, prudence, and being considerate are considered important qualities. Choosing your masters to obey them is a form of obentia, the obedience to the rule. The rule rules also the chosen. They are subject to the law, as are our worshipful master. Number 5. The cellarer. In monastic life as well as in Masonic life, the cellarer is an important functionary. He needs to be a very wise man, sober, not a great eater himself. He is not to vex the brothers with contemptuous refusal. He should be as a father to the community and should not be a miser. Benedict thought of everything because in chapter 40 he gives directions for the measure of drink. He states that wine is by no means a drink for monks, but it is impossible to persuade monks of this. At least let us agree to drink sparingly. In some lodges, this can be sound advice, one would think. Number 6. The porter. Monasteries know a functionary who can be compared to our tiler. In any case, between master and tiler, there is a specific relationship representing respectively the East and the West. This axis forms one of the fundaments of the way in which the lodge can be connected to the world, to the West. Worshipful master and tiler represent the opening to the East and to the West, respectively. In the initiation of a candidate, the tiler plays a specific part, checking his credentials before admitting him to the lodge. Porters of the monastery have a similar role. They should be somewhat older and wiser brothers, able to receive guests and question them about their credentials. Number 7. Those who are absent. Brothers who are absent are commemorated always at the last prayer. This is very much like the tiler's toast we know in our ritual, in which, just before closing the festive board, absent brothers are remembered and we wish them a safe return home. Number 8. Novices. According to the rule, novices are supposed to be silent. Very seldom are they permitted to talk. In Dutch Masonic ritual, there is the tradition that before passing and raising, the candidate presents himself with a speech explaining what he has learned during the period of being an entered apprentice or a fellow craft. Entered apprentices especially are expected to comment on the lodge and its proceedings. This is a peculiar similarity with the rule because in Chapter 3 it is stated that every time important business needs to be done, the abbot should call together the whole community and state the matter to be discussed. To these meetings all are invited because the Lord often reveals to the younger what is best. The speech of the entered apprentice is meant to hold up a mirror to the older brothers. It also confirms the fact that really there are only apprentices. Number 9. The good zeal. The only zeal allowed to monks is the fervor with which they should anticipate one another in honor, endure one another's infirmities, whether in body or in character, always asking themselves what benefits another. A worthy zeal for any Mason, one would think. Number 10. Receiving brethren. The ceremony of initiation is reflected in Chapter 58 of the Rule. No one newly come is to be granted an easy entrance. Only if the newcomer persists in knocking on the gate and he is seen to bear patiently the harsh treatment and difficulty of admission for 4 or 5 days is he to be admitted as a novice. A senior, the Master of Novices, is assigned to him to guide him through his novitiate, a functionary like our junior warden, who is responsible for the entered apprentices. Just like in our lodges, the rule provides for those who, having left, want to be received again. Number 11. The workshop. The words used by Benedict in this chapter 4 are the same as used in our craft. The French version of the rule calls the place where the monks work l'atelier, which is exactly the same word as French brothers use in naming the lodge. In Dutch, the name for the lodge is werkplaats, just as it is called in the rule. Number 12. Hierarchic structure. The functionaries of both monastic and Masonic organizations can be compared very well. The monastic abbot is analogous to the worshipful master. The monastic cellarer is analogous to the Masonic steward. The monastic porter, analogous to the Masonic tiler. The monastic master of novices is analogous to the junior warden. The monastic weekly reader is analogous to the Masonic orator. The monastic deans analogous to Masonic officers. Monastic novices analogous to entered apprentices. Monastic professed monks analogous to fellowcraft. And monastic seniors analogous to Masonic master masons. Monastic lodges. An interesting dimension of the similarities between monastic and Masonic orders is the existence of monastic lodges. Some French sources even indicate a more than spiritually shared parenthood between the monastic and Masonic orders. However, that seems to fall short of the warning given in Gould's History, or the conclusion of Brodsky, who calls Masonic history, quote, un domaine où les passions dominent la raison, unquote, a domain where passion rules reason. In the 18th century, various Masonic lodges were erected in Benedictine monasteries. Now, keeping in mind the attitude of official Roman Catholic Church towards Freemasonry, this seems rather interesting. The well-known Frère Benimeli mentions in his Archives Secretes that in the last 40 years of the 18th century, an impressive number of Freemasons were active in the Catholic Church, either as monks or as priests. He gives examples from all over Europe, concentrating, however, on France and almost never mentioning England in this respect. The study of Frère Benimeli is important too because of its impressive lists of sources, as well as its lists of clergymen, monks, and other functionaries, among whom are to be found bishops, priors, etc. This paper cites 3 examples among over 100, the sources of which can be found outside Frère Benimeli as well. On June 24, 1778, a lodge was founded in Fécamp in the monastery l'Abbé Royal de les Tres Saintes Trinités. Out of 29 monks in this monastery, 9 got permission of the prayer to join this lodge. The lodge itself was built on the grounds of the monastery. The name of the lodge was La Triple Unité. Other founding members of the lodge included a priest, a taxman, an officer in the army, an engineer, and a commissary of the navy. All founding members were master masons, implying that they had been masons rather longer. In the years after the foundation, other monks joined and some priests. These Masonic relations were helpful for the monastery during the French Revolution. The city council, one of whom was a Mason as well, refused to execute the laws to prohibit the monasteries in France. This lodge is tiled, or closed, in 1790, refounded in 1811, tiled again in 1828, refounded in 1860, and tiled in the war year of 1940. In the monastery at Ferrez in Gataïs, the same thing happened. The lodge Saint-Émile is created in 1786 and is located in the monastery. 4 of the 8 monks join the lodge. Even in the famous Abbey of Clairvaux, A lodge called La Vertu was erected in L'An de la Vraie Luminaire, 5785, in 1785. Sign language. Most, if not all, contemplative monastic orders know a rule of silence. The Rule of Benedict, chapter 6, states that, quote, "The spirit of silence ought to lead us at times to refrain even from good speech," unquote. There are various statutes from the Middle Ages and later showing Benedict making the sign for silence by holding his finger to his closed lips. There is an exception, namely, that speaking and teaching belong to the master. One wonders, by the way, if this master is the same as the one mentioned in the introduction to the rule. In any case, this tradition is roughly the same as in our craft. Rules of silence are known in all old monastic rules, from Pachomius onward. The rule of silence was never intended to totally ban speech as a form of communication. Rischenberg says about the rule of silence, quote, "Il est bien sûr qu'il n'a été absolu nulle part," unquote, stating that it has never been known to be absolute. The sign language is interesting because of the rich symbolism. Some of the signs can be the same as in the lodge. Rischenberg, for instance, mentions the Cistercian sign of the martyr, which is like cutting one's throat. This sign also means death. Masons all remember being introduced to the sign of the entered apprentice, promising that they would rather have their throat cut than betray the secret of our craft. Part 2. Freemasonry and Enlightenment, Doctrinal Origins and Lineage. A peculiar statement can be found in the original constitutions of the Freemasons, also known as the Anderson Constitution, Article 6, Section 2, in which Freemasonry explicitly attempts to self-identify with the fundaments of the primitive Catholic religion. Quote, "Therefore, no private piques or quarrels must be brought within the door of the lodge, far less any quarrels about religion or nations or state policy, we being only, as Masons, of the Catholic religion above mentioned. We are also of all nations, tongues, kindreds, and languages, and are resolved against all politics, as what never yet conduced to the welfare of the lodge, nor ever will," unquote. The meaning of the identification with Catholicism is expounded in the Proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons, volumes 103 to 105 by the Grand Lodge of the State of New York, page 104. Quote, "The part of the sentence quoted from Charge 1 means exclusively the Christian religion, while the words in Charge 6, 2 are not to be construed as meaning the Roman Catholic religion, but those dogmas which are held in common by all Christian creeds," unquote. By which can only be meant, as we will see, the original theology of Christianity, not to be confused with the Bible. This Freemasonic constitution was drafted by John de Sagulars, alongside James Anderson, both Christian clergymen. Together, they are considered the chief founders of the speculative form of Freemasonry, which arose during the 18th century, and from which branched off all modern Freemasonic organizations. As can be read from the Protestant Museum, quote, "Speculative Freemasonry, which came into being in the 18th century, took its origins from operative Freemasonry, created by medieval Masons. The movement was founded in England in 1723, when the Anderson Constitution was drawn up, which set out how it was to be run. The French Huguenot, de Sagulars, who had been forced to flee his native country at the time of the Revocation, and who later became a pastor in the Anglican Church, was one of those who helped to draw up the document," unquote. De Sagulars has been described as a very important figure in institutionalizing Freemasonry, according to Masonic historian Albert Mackie. Quote, "To few Freemasons of the present day, except to those who have been made Freemasonry a subject of especial study, is the name of de Sagulars very familiar. but it is well that they should note that to him, perhaps more than to any other man, are we indebted for the present existence of Freemasonry as a living institution, for it was his learning and social position that gave a standing to the institution, which brought to its support noblemen and men of influence, so that the insignificant assemblage of 4 London lodges at the Apple Tree Tavern has expanded into an association which now shelters the entire civilized world. And the moving spirit of all this was John Theophilus Desaguliers, unquote. And that's from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry and Its Kindred Sciences, Volume 2, page 30. Desaguliers was very much influenced by Isaac Newton, who was also a Christian. The Oxford Companion to the History of Modern Science, edited by John L. Heilbronn, page 571, explains how Isaac Newton and his conception of space and time was influenced by Neoplatonism. Quote, "Since the publication of Edwin A. Burt's Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science in 1932 and Alexander Quarry's many historical studies, particularly his Etudes Galiléennes in 1939, historians of science have debated the extent to which Neoplatonism influenced or inspired Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton. The case of Johannes Kepler seems particularly clear. Throughout his astronomical work, culminating in his Harmonious Mundi 1618, Kepler sought the geometrical structure of the universe, believing it to be based on the 5 perfect solids and characterized by musical harmonies. Newton was influenced by another important school of Neoplatonism that emerged at the University of Cambridge in the 17th century. The Cambridge Platonists, appalled by the mechanical philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, created a synthesis of Christianity and Platonism. Although most of the group applied themselves to theology, metaphysics, and ethics, Henry More, a fellow of the Royal Society, ventured closer to natural philosophy. After an initial flush of enthusiasm, he reacted against Descartes' identification of space and matter with extension. He made space an attribute of God's and the means by which God acted on bodies. Newton studied with More, whose concept of space and time as the sense organs of God helped shape Newton's concept of absolute space and time." Unquote. Thus we read from modern Belgian intellectual Peter van Osta, quote, "Isaac Newton and the Newtonian synthesis between natural philosophy and natural theology had a profound influence on the development of early Freemasonry. The same theological developments from which Isaac Newton derived his synthesis influenced people like the Presbyterian James Anderson and the Huguenot and Newtonian John Theophilus Desaguliers in drafting the deistic and non-sacerdotal constitutions of the Freemasons. And more generally, quote, "Another philosophical cause for conflict between the Roman Catholic Church and Freemasonry is the great divide between the Aristotelian philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pythagorean, Neoplatonic, and Newtonian philosophical roots of speculative Freemasonry." Unquote. It must be understood that there has been a long rift or conflict within the Catholic Church between the more traditional feudal faction of the Church, which Van Osta characterizes as Thomistic and Aristotelian, and the hardcore Neoplatonist communistic monastics with their vows of poverty and renunciation of private property in accordance with the insane desire for material detachment from reality. Here's a quotation from History of Political and Religious Persecutions, page 498, which speaks to this issue. Quote, "The churches and sects of Christendom were divided, and are so still, into 2 sets, one of which attaches a superior importance to religious services and external actions, and another which condemns them, because it acknowledges nothing as good except the state of the inner man, in the purity of a transcendental spiritualism, which takes of matter no account whatsoever. The struggle between these 2 opinions has often caused much bloodshed in the Christian world, and involved one party or the other in the most arbitrary and outrageous persecutions, as we have seen in the present in other books, and where these persecutions have been most rigorous, the fanaticism and exaggeration of the persecuted sect and doctrine have there reached the most singular extremities," unquote. This is why the works of Catholic mystics, including Joachim of Fiore, Meister Eckhart, and even Francis Borgia under the guise of Ignatius Loyola, were at least met with hostility, or at most were branded as heresy by the mainline traditional Catholic Church. And it is because Freemasonry has adopted this strain of monkish Neoplatonism that it was therefore condemned by the Catholic Church in official papal documents. Van Osta provides another striking insight to this effect. Quote, "When looking at the Neoplatonic mystical theology of Christianity, with people like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, Johannes Scotus Eurigena, Hildegard von Bingen, Meister Eckhart, Johannes Tauler, Henry Cicero, Nicholas Cusanus, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross, we find elements of the same tradition of which Freemasonry draws its inspiration. The Neoplatonic tradition remained a living tradition only inside the monasteries, while the worldly church moved away from Platonism towards Aristotle. During the Renaissance, philosophers like Basilos Bessarion, Marsilio Fenicio, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola would bring Neoplatonism back into the Western secular world. As the Neoplatonic tradition remained alive within the walls of monasteries, such as with the Dominicans, a monk or nun will understand the Neoplatonic symbolism of Freemasonry, although he or she may not approve of it, of course." Unquote. Hence, when we reflect upon the words of the Masonic Constitution, in which it identifies the craft with Catholicism, we can thus interpret it to mean that, like the Catholic monks, Masonry identifies with the original theology of the Church, coming from men like its first systematic theologian, student of Ammonius Saccas and classmate of Plotinus, Origen of Alexandria, and his Christian Neoplatonist school, as well as the early ecumenical councils, where false, metaphysical, and irrational doctrines like the hypostatic union and Trinity have their foundations. Clement of Alexandria, another Christian Neoplatonist and teacher of Origen, appropriately referred to Greek philosophy as an additional Old Testament of Christianity, in effect a lens through which the New Testament is interpreted by the priests. It should be noted that Aquinas also heavily leaned on Neoplatonism, but incorporated more Aristotelian elements, namely in his ethical theory, than did the strict Neoplatonists. So instead of an Aristotelian versus Neoplatonist rivalry in the Catholic Church like Van Oster describes, really it suggests more of a substantially Neoplatonist versus pure Neoplatonist rivalry. It is significant to note that this war between the monastic and traditional church has in the recent centuries been won by the monastics, in particular the Jesuits, who in 1814 were restored to the ranks of the church after having been abolished forever in 1773 by Clement XIV in his papal bull Dominic Redemptor Noster, for which Clement was later assassinated by the Jesuits. As Hannah Arendt, one of the most respected political philosophers of the 20th century, writes in The Origins of Totalitarianism, page 102, quote, "Since the beginning of the 19th century, the direction of the Church's international policy had passed into the Jesuits' hands." Unquote. Arendt also cites on the same page H. Boehmer, Les Jésuites, translated from the German, Paris 1910, page 284, quote, "Since 1820, no such thing as independent national churches able to resist the Jesuit-dictated orders of the Pope has existed. The higher clergy of our day have pitched their tents in front of the Holy See, and the Church has become what Bellarmine, the great Jesuit controversialist, always demanded it should become, an absolute monarchy, whose policies can be directed by the Jesuits, and whose development can be determined by pressing a button." Unquote. As a result of this triumph of the Jesuit monastics over the traditional clergy, it is why we see a Jesuit at the helm of the Catholic Church today, Pope Francis. This also explains the abundance of Freemasons within the Catholic Church, as exposed, for example, by David Yallop in his book In God's Name. Another important shared concept within both Masonic and monkish views of man is belief in an immortal soul, which is a key teaching right from Neoplatonism, as can be read in Plotinus's Fourth Ennead, Treatise 7 on the immortality of the soul. We read in Fraternal Review, published by the Southern California Research Lodge, citing from the Master's Lecture on Immortality, Evans Lodge number 524, printed 1923, quote, "Belief in the immortality of the soul is the basic, fundamental law, the eternal lesson, and the foundation of Freemasonry. To every Freemason, the soul of man is immortal," unquote. Of course, Christianity also teaches the immortal soul. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines soul as follows, quote, "The spiritual principle of human beings. The soul is the subject of human consciousness and freedom. Soul and body together form one unique human nature. Each human soul is individual and immortal, immediately created by God. The soul does not die with the body, from which it is separated by death, and with which it will be reunited at the final resurrection," unquote. Likewise, in The Orthodox Doctrine of the Apostolic Eastern Church, or A Compendium of Christian Theology by Platon, who was a metropolitan of Moscow, page 47, quote, "We have an immortal soul. When we attentively examine ourselves, we feel that there is within us a being different from our body, having the power of knowing itself and other things besides. Such a being we call soul, which is doubtless immortal and incorporeal," unquote. While the concept of the soul is integral to theology among the non-cloistered arms of the Catholic Church, there's no doubt it is emphasized and expressed more so within the monkish orders. This is why all monks dress, groom, and look the same, so as to strip each man of his physical characteristics, thus easing a feeling of disattachment from material reality and promoting interconnection with one's supposed soul for the purpose of achieving mystic unity with God, or the One in Neoplatonic parlance. What else does Freemasonry teach about the soul? According to The Meaning of Masonry by W.L. Wilmshurst, who is a British Freemasonic author, quote, "The secrets of Freemasonry and of initiation are largely connected with the process of introversion of the soul to its own center," unquote. Interestingly, Wilmshurst goes on to recommend the writing of Plato and Meister Eckhart to understand mental discipline. Additionally, Richard Casaro, who is author of various books on Freemasonry, writes, quote, "Freemasonry was founded not just to put man in touch with his soul, but to help him rediscover its higher powers now temporarily covered up by the body," unquote. To better understand what Masonry means by this peculiar emphasis on harnessing the maximum potential of one's soul, it will be observed how this doctrine of the soul was given a new metaphysical explanation within Western Christianity by the 13th century mystic Neoplatonist Catholic monk Meister Eckhart, who we will be giving special attention to in regard to him being deeply inspirational to Illuminism and Freemasonic doctrine. Eckhart was one of the most influential 13th century Christian Neoplatonists in his day and remained widely read in the later Middle Ages. He has been called the greatest German speculative mystic by Encyclopedia Britannica, and in the Journal of Western Esotericism, he is described as quite arguably the greatest Christian mystic of all time. Accordingly, a foremost Eckhart scholar, Richard Woods, has written a book called Meister Eckhart, Master of Mystics. Before digging into Eckhart's conception of the soul, let us first emphasize exactly how important Neoplatonism, and in particular that of Meister Eckhart, have been on the development of Freemasonry and other Illuminist organizations. Mackie was very forthcoming in his Encyclopedia of Freemasonry when he wrote, quote, "Much of the symbolic teaching of the advanced degrees of Freemasonry has been derived from the school of the Neoplatonists," unquote. The Alumbrados, which was a Spanish Illuminati sect, and possibly linked to the early Jesuits, was a society rooted in the teachings of Eckhart, according to Eckhart scholar Richard Woods in his book Christian Spirituality. The This also puts quite a wrench in the neo-Nazi position of the Alumbrados being Judaic to support their Jewish Loyola hypothesis. George Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher and theologian, was also influenced by Eckhart and disciples of Eckhart, including von Baader and Jacob Baum. A member of the Bavarian Illuminati, the Freemason Franz Xaver von Baader was heavily influenced by Eckhart and saw himself as the spiritual heir of Eckhart and Thomas Aquinas. From David Livingstone's book Transhumanism. Likewise, the German Romantic philosopher Friedrich Hegel regarded Napoleon as embodying the world soul, meaning that in him was fulfilled the process of history. Ultimately, Hegel produced a philosophy of history which was an articulation, in Christian terms, of the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. Hegel is regarded as the leading exponent of German idealism after Jacob Bohm, who heavily influenced him. While it is not proven that Hegel was a member of the Illuminati, as demonstrated by Glenn Alexander Mackie in Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, Hegel did often refer cryptically to Illuminati and Masonic symbols. There are references throughout Hegel's writings to many of the leading figures of the Hermetic tradition, including Meister Eckhart, Giordano Bruno, Paracelsus, and Baum. As pointed out by Ernst Benz in Mystical Sources of German Romantic Philosophy, the chief conduit of the ideas of Baum to Hegel and other German idealists of the time was St. Martin. Hegel was introduced to the ideas of Baum through his reading of Illuminati member Franz von Baader, a devoted student of Meister Eckhart. Jacob Bohm was influenced by Eckhart, according to the book Meister Eckhart on Divine Knowledge, published by Yale University Press. It also states Hegel and numerous other philosophers were influenced by Eckhart. Quote, although it is only in the past few decades that the late medieval German Dominican spiritual master Meister Eckhart has come to be regarded as the greatest of all Western Christian mystics, in the nearly 7 centuries since his death, he has exerted an extraordinarily, if largely unacknowledged, influence upon Western culture. Besides Johannes Tauler and Henry Cicero, direct disciples who themselves became eminent theologians, the list of those who have come under Eckhart's enduring spell includes such spiritual and philosophical luminaries as Jan von Ruysbroek, Nicholas of Cusa, Jacob Bohm, G.W.F. Hegel, Friedrich Schelling, Arthur Schopenhauer, Rudolf Steiner, C.G. Jung, Martin Heidegger, and Thomas Merton." Unquote. We read more on Bohm's influences and Neoplatonic alchemical movements which he influenced from Wikipedia. Quote, Bohm's writing shows the influence of Neoplatonist and alchemical writers such as Paracelsus, while remaining firmly within a Christian tradition. He has in turn greatly influenced many anti-authoritarian and mystical movements, such as radical pietism, including the Ephrata Cloister and Society of the Women in the Wilderness, the Religious Society of Friends, the Philadelphians, the Gestalians, the Harmony Society, the Zorite Separatists, Rosicrucianism, Martinism, and Christian Theosophy. Bohm's disciple and mentor, the Leibniz physician Balthasar Walther, who had traveled to the Holy Land in search of magical, Kabbalistic, and alchemical wisdom, also introduced Kabbalistic ideas into Bohm's thought. Unquote. It is at this point that I would like to point out how the Kabbalah and its main text, the Zohar, come from Neoplatonism. We read from The Scientific Revolution, an encyclopedia by William E. Burns on page 157, quote, Kabbalah, a form of Jewish mysticism and magic, was widely accepted in the early modern Jewish community, and many prominent rabbis were Kabbalists. It was also increasingly influential among Christians during the Renaissance in the 17th century. Originally an adaptation of Neoplatonism to Judaism, Kabbalah was based on the idea that the universe proceeds from God, not by creation from nothing, but by divine emanation. Unquote. We also read from the Zohar, Volume 1, by Daniel C. Matt, published Stanford University Press, page XLV III, quote, under the influence of Neoplatonism, The Kabbalists came to describe the Sephirot as emerging in sequence." Unquote. From the same source on page 118, we read, quote, "The early Kabbalists, drawing on Jewish Neoplatonism, understood tohu and bohu as referring to primordial matter and form, respectively. Tohu, primordial matter, was seen as the root of evil, a Platonic notion developed in Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, while bohu, form, was the origin of good." Unquote. Continuing from the same source on page LXXI, quote, "The Zohar learned from the Neoplatonist milieu within which it existed to speak of the flow of energy, usually described as light, from one cosmic realm to the next." Unquote. Kenyon College's Department of Religion also has an article on the Kabbalah published on their website, from which we read, quote, "A central text of Kabbalah is the Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Splendor, a commentary on the Pentateuch. While it is ascribed to a 2nd century rabbi, Simon Bar Yochai, scholars believe it was written and distributed between 1280 and 1286. Moses de Leon, a native of Granada and part of the mystical school of Castile, Spain, claimed to have acquired the ancient manuscript and simply written it down for publishing. However, after his death, his wife admitted that no such manuscript existed, and Leon had created the Zohar himself. To confirm this, Leon wrote the book in the Aramaic language, but included translated Spanish words and grammatical errors. Also, the ideas and symbolism fit within the theosophy of 13th century Kabbalah, which developed out of Jewish Neoplatonism and Gnosticism of the Middle Ages." Cyril O'Regan, a professor of theology at Notre Dame, lists Eckhart, Joachim of Fiore, and Baum as primary influencers of Hegel. Quote, "Hegel's specific act of adjudication constitutes an interpretation of extraordinary complexity, appealing on different occasions to distinct aspects of the Christian tradition for support. At one time, St. Paul, another Luther, another the varieties of mysticism, represented by Eckhart, Joachim of Fiore, and Jacob Baum." Unquote. Eckhart's work went into obscurity from between the 16th and 19th centuries, which could account for some of the air of secrecy around the beliefs of these groups during their times. Lamars Latkovskis, a 33rd degree Latvian Mason, journalist, publicist, and politician, writing for the Supreme Council 33rd degree for Latvia of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, says of Eckhart's influence on Masonry and alchemy, quote, "Up to the end of the Middle Ages, Western or Christian mystic at its root unites with Eastern spiritual traditions. Christian visionaries Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and Meister Eckhart was strongly influenced from the East. The Freemasonry borrows much from these men. Meister Eckhart is the central figure. He is the most prominent representative of Christian mysticism. He has borrowed much of the Eastern teachings. He has had a very significant effect on the alchemists and Freemasonry." Unquote. Eckhart is precisely dubbed as the ultimate ecumenist, which is consistent with Freemasonry's ecumenical nature, admitting into its ranks anyone who professes a belief in God. Here's an excerpt of Meister Eckhart, a mystic warrior for our times, on Eckhart's broad and deep ecumenism. Quote, "Eckhart is a leader like none other in deep ecumenism. I think this book demonstrates that. Who else has worked out of the depth of his own tradition, his Christianity, and has been named a Hindu by Hindus, a Buddhist by Buddhists, a Sufi by Sufis, a depth psychologist who discovered the self by a depth psychologist, a shaman by students of shamanism." Unquote. It is somewhat interesting, though probably coincidental, how the anglicized version of the name Meister Eckhart is Master Eckhart, juxtaposed with the rank of Master Mason. Medieval Masonry was just starting to take root during Eckhart's time. Sources say he could have been born as early as 1250. Though there likely wasn't much, if any, overlap between Eckhart and medieval Masonry when he lived, due to him being from Germany, while the Masons existed in England, A fact relevant to our study is that the Catholic Church was a primary employer of the Masons, and the first known Masonic workshops and guilds operated from abbeys and cathedrals. We read from Wikipedia, quote, "The historical record shows two levels of organization in medieval Masonry, the lodge and the guild. The original use of the word lodge indicates a workshop erected on the site of a major work, the first mention being Vale Royal Abbey in 1278. Later, it gained the secondary meaning of the community of Masons in a particular place. The earliest surviving records of these are the laws and ordinances of the lodge at York Minster in 1352, unquote. To be sure about the point at which Neoplatonism was brought into Freemasonry, it certainly appears to have been introduced at the advent of speculative Masonry. The Real History Behind the Templars by Sharon Newman emphasizes that the majority of Neoplatonism was infused into Masonry with its revival in the 18th century, no doubt thanks to the works of Eckhartian disciple Jacob Baum. Quote, "It was in this atmosphere that the first English lodges arose at the beginning of the 18th century. While using many of the symbols in the basic myth of the origin of the Masons' Guild, the English soon added rituals based on their research into alchemy, Neoplatonism, and Hermetic teaching. By 1720, Freemasonry had spread to France and then to Germany and the rest of Europe. Rather than saying that Freemasonry was born out of the Guild of Masons, it might be more helpful to say that learned men who wished to work together and exchange ideas adopted the symbolism and structures used by working Masons," unquote. Concerning Jacob Baum and Meister Eckhart's theology being the basis of speculative Masonry, remember Isaac Newton, who inspired de Sagulars, the founder of speculative Masonry, was influenced by the Cambridge Neoplatonists, especially by Henry Moore, from whom Newton's pantheistic theory of space-time as sense organs of God was derived. As of April 28, 2020, there has been a research grant awarded from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to professors from Cambridge University and McGill University for research on the reception of German mysticism in early modern England. The article detailing the grant makes known that Henry Moore of the Cambridge Neoplatonists, who influenced Isaac Newton, was himself a student of Meister Eckhart's pantheistic German mysticism. The article goes on to say that the entire tradition of German mysticism was really established through the reception of the Cambridge Platonists who disseminated the German mystical writings. Mackie, too, admits the influence of Baum on the Masonic lodges of Russia. He says, quote, "The theosophic doctrines of St. Martin were introduced into the Masonic lodges of Russia by Count Gabrienko and Admiral Pleshcheyev, and soon became popular. Under them, the Martinist lodges of Russia became distinguished not only for their Masonic and religious spirit, although too much tinged with the mysticism of Jacob Baum and their founder, but for an active zeal in practical works of charity of both a private and public character," unquote. Finally, in general, you can also read The Influence of Neoplatonic Thought on Freemasonry, which is a series of essays by distinguished writer and essayist Fabio Venzi, who is founder and editor of the philosophical Masonic journal De Hominis Dignitate and Grand Master of the regular Grand Lodge of Italy. Now back to Eckhart and his outworking of the soul in order to get at the meaning behind the previous quotations about Freemasonry and the power potential of the soul. Let's see exactly what Eckhart taught on the soul. This is from Ninian Smart in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Quote, "Eckhart's account of God and the universe depended not only on the theology and metaphysical speculation, but also on his interpretation of mystical experience. Thus, he distinguished between Deus, or God, as found in the three persons of the Trinity, and Deitas, or the Godhead, which is the ground of God, but is indescribable. The Godhead, through an eternal process, manifests itself as the persons. In the same way, Eckhart distinguished between faculties of the soul, such as memory, and the ground, or ground of the soul, also called the Funklin, scintilla, or spark. By contemplation, it is possible to attain this Grund, leaving aside the discursive and imaginative activities that normally characterize conscious life. In doing this, one gains unity with the Godhead. Although Eckhart gave some sort of explanation for the ineffability of the Godhead, namely that it is a pure unity and thus not describable, the main motive for his doctrine lay in a feature of mystical experiences, that it involves a mental state not describable in terms of thoughts or images. The need to give an account of contemplative knowledge led Eckhart to evolve a complex psychology. The soul operates at the lowest level through the body. Thus, it has powers of digestion, assimilation, and sensation. At a higher level, the soul functions through the powers of anger, desire, and the lower intellect, the sensus communis, or common sense, which combines what is given through the various senses in perception. At a third level, the soul works through memory, will, and the higher intellect. At the fourth level, it is possible in principle to know things in total abstraction, that is, as pure forms, which is therefore to know them as they pre-exist in God's intellect. Finally, the spark of the soul can possess a kind of knowledge in which God is known as he is." Unquote. So when Wilmshurst mentions that the secrets of Freemasonry involve the process of introversion of the soul to its own center, or when Casaro writes that Freemasonry was founded to put man in touch with his soul and rediscover higher powers, this is clearly based off of Eckhart's conception of the soul, where one is said to attain purity of the soul, or the ground of the soul, as Eckhart puts it, through ascetic practices. Wilmshurst suggests Masons to read Eckhart in order to gain mental discipline, by which is meant this same concept of the grounding of the soul, enabling one to achieve mystic oneness, for the highest part of the soul in Eckhart's view is in essence intellectual. The New Catholic Encyclopedia states, quote, "From these presuppositions, Eckhart reached the conclusion that the most elevated part of the soul, that part that engaged in contact with God, was in essence intellectual. This Kraft, Virtus, is a spark, Seelen Funklein, or scintilla anime. The foundation of the soul, Grund der Seele, is something, Etwas, uncreated and uncreatable. It is this in man that is equal to God, in the seat of divine life, of the truly contemplative life where the Spirit reigns. It is also in this uncreated etwas of the soul that the birth of the Word takes place and resemblance to God is realized. This birth, which is mainly described in Eckhart's commentary on St. John, comes after liberation from sin and the laying bare of the soul. It creates the noble man and is consummated in identity. Henceforth, the spiritual man is one with the deity in its true essence, not the God whose idolatrous image we form for ourselves. True contemplation is thus attained. It is an intellectual kind of contemplation, but it unites vision and love in a single act, and man finds all bliss uniquely from God, through God, and in God. This teaching has been called speculative or essential mysticism." Unquote. So it is seen that since all humans are said to have a ground or foundation of the soul, it thereby implies equality with God. In Neoplatonic language, Eckhart is identifying man in his grounded soul with the nous, also known as the divine mind, the first ontological emanation from the One, corresponding to the second person in the Trinity. It is why Eckhart says it is here where the birth of the Word takes place, referring to the Logos doctrine in Christianity. As Meister Eckhart claimed, quote, "The eye with which I see God is the same with which God sees me," unquote. Besides being utterly blasphemous, to isolate just this notion of universal equality by virtue of a soul is blatant communism. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy affirms that in Eckhart's view, since pantheistic unity with God currently exists, this unity itself is the only thing that matters. Quote, "The goal of the rational form of life, of living in and with the spiritual perfections at the level of that transcendental being, or being convertible with the termini transcendentes, the one, the true, and the good, is living in and from the absolute one, in and from the divine nature as presuppositionless unity. If the ground of the soul as something uncreated and uncreatable, attributes which Meister Eckhart's contemporary Eckhart von Grundig explicitly ascribes to the ground or little spark of the soul that Meister Eckhart often invokes, thus indicating that he in fact employed these attributes, if human reason, not as human, but as reason, is one with the divine nature or ground, then man is no longer simply on the way towards unity. Instead, unity is something that has already been achieved. This being unified is alone what matters, because man, as reason, has left behind everything that stands in the way of his living in and from unity, and because the ground of the soul is more interior in this unity than it is in itself. This is true equanimity, letting go, as the goal of human life." Again, if unity itself is all that matters, obviously God, family, nation, culture, language, property, and so on do not matter. If the main purpose of human life is letting go, the implication is therefore abandonment of society and all of its institutions, along with community, into unnatural conditions of reclusive asceticism, celibacy, veganism, and other forms of social derangement, exactly as monastics behave. This must be understood to be absolutely communist. In light of this, remember how we saw that Hegel was influenced by Meister Eckhart? Well, guess who else Hegel and Eckhart influenced? None other than Karl Marx. Matthew Fox writes in Meister Eckhart, a Mystic Warrior for Our Times, on pages 235 through 236, quote, "Philosopher Ernst Bloch has credited Meister Eckhart with influencing the thinking of the German philosopher Karl Marx. How did Meister Eckhart influence Marx to develop these ideas? Bloch, who is an expert on Marx, says that Eckhart's teaching did not serve the ruling class, and in Eckhart the heretical anti-ecclesiastical lay movement of the late Middle Ages became articulate in German, which is a decisive factor in any socialist evaluation." Eckhart scholar Rainer Schumann agrees with Bloch. Schumann says Eckhart's theology provides a mysticism of the left that would designate the appropriation by man of his authentic good when he is alienated by the dogma of an inaccessible heaven. Eckhart's preaching that everyone is an aristocrat elevates the poorest of the poor to their own nobility. The political implications of this spiritual attitude are partly what inspired Marx to suggest with socialism that every worker is equal and should be treated equally and receive a fair share of the wealth of his or her labor creates. With that in mind, it may at first be surprising to realize that this Neoplatonic Christian soul doctrine has in fact been at the heart of the prevailing freedom-oriented socio-political philosophy of the late modern period of human history, approximately between 1750 and the early 1900s, which came from the Age of Enlightenment and gave rise to secular nation-states. The reason for this becomes more clear when one realizes that the original ideology of the communist movements, such as the Bolsheviks, was actually libertarianism. You can read that from Isaac Ducher in Stalin, A Political Biography, Oxford University Press, published 1967, page 217 to 218, where he admits the libertarian spirit of the first Bolshevik revolutionaries, and also Robin Hahnel in Economic Justice and Democracy, Routledge Press, page 138, where Hahnel says, quote, "Libertarian socialists played a major role in the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. Libertarian socialists played a dominant role in the Mexican Revolution of 1911. 20 years after World War I was over, libertarian socialists were still strong enough to spearhead the social revolution that swept across Republican Spain in 1936 and 1937, unquote. These libertarian ideas, being equivalent to American egalitarian values, were imported from writings of the French Enlightenment, chiefly consisting of Diderot's Encyclopedia. As Wikipedia reads, quote, "The most influential publication of the Enlightenment was the Encyclopedia. Published between 1751 and 1772 in 35 volumes, it was compiled by Diderot, D'Alembert, and a team of 150 scientists and philosophers. It helped spread the ideas of the Enlightenment across Europe and beyond," unquote. Both Diderot and D'Alembert were Freemasons. Diderot most definitely believed in a soul and an ability to tap into its higher potential, as per Eckhartian Neoplatonic Rhineland mysticism, transferred into the Alumbrados and then to Quietism, and finally to the Encyclopedists, as we will see in a moment. Diderot, of course, also believed in a universal equality of persons, obviously based on an Eckhartian conceptualization of the soul, as we listen to Eric Voegelin, who is one of the most eminent conservative political philosophers of the 20th century, in his Structures of Consciousness lecture, where he speaks to how the entirety of Diderot's encyclopedia was conceived out of Neoplatonic states of consciousness. This Neoplatonic state of consciousness is the Eckhartian quietistic contemplative state by which one's soul is grounded. Remember, Eckhart taught that knowing is the basic attribute of the divine. As further attestation of this, in Let There Be Enlightenment, The Religious and Mystical Sources of Rationality, published in 2018 on Johns Hopkins University Press, its authors Matson and Edelston describe Diderot's espousal of quietism and disattachment on pages 258 to 260. Under the heading Diderot's Philosophy of Dreaming, we read, quote, "Given this configuration, it is all the more astonishing that Diderot would have recourse to the language of quietism, especially in contributions to the encyclopedia that address the boundaries of religious and philosophical thinking. For instance, his study of Neoplatonist thought in his article Ecclestemy stipulates that all is lost when theology degenerates into philosophy and philosophy into theology. It produces a ridiculous monster rather than a compound of one and other. Deluded by their spiritual aspirations, the eclectics, according to Diderot, pursued knowledge not through natural intelligence, but by recognizing God within the soul. This approach informed their conviction that the most worthy occupation of man is thus to separate his soul from all tangible things, draw it profoundly into itself, isolate it, and lose it in contemplation to the point that it entirely forgets itself. These references to annihilation and self-forgetfulness, which harken back to propositions advanced by Fenelon and Guillaume, were by no means casually placed. Diderot sharpens the point with a quip: "Quietism is quite ancient, as one can see." Yet, even while seeming to recoil from the stance, Diderot implicates himself in its ideal of dispossession. First, he offers a general definition of the eclectic that resembles the 18th century philosophy as one who, trampling underfoot prejudice, antiquity, authority, dares to think for himself, and to admit nothing unless by proof of experience and reason. Moreover, personal speculations, as reflected in his encyclopedia articles, convinced him that philosophies could become the objects of their own iconoclasm, with illuminating results. In this respect, Diderot might be regarded as a philosophical eclectic in his own right, sufficiently impetuous to challenge the axioms of his movement to forestall their ossification into mere dogma. Diderot proceeds by observing that the profound contemplation advocated by the eclectics gives rise to a delightful repose in which ceases all the dissonance that surrounds us and keeps us from experiencing the divine harmony of all intelligible things. These terms echo an altered state described in a previous volume of the encyclopedia, in which Diderot himself had inquired, "But what is a delightful repose?" His response, the article Delicieux, describes a moment of enchantment in weakness, in which the self experiences neither memory of the past, nor desire for the future, nor concern with the present. The suspension of time indicates a break in the continuity of exterior sensations, so that one advances by an imperceptible movement from waking to sleeping. During this liminal state, reflection and memory no longer secure the possession of ideas that the mind exercises when awake. Rather, one under the sway of delight might return to a state of semi-consciousness, if not to think of some distinct thing, then at least to feel all the sweetness of his existence. Yet, in hindsight, it becomes clear that this existence, while perceptible, remains impossible to call one's own, since the self enjoyed the use of it from an entirely passive possession, without being attached to it, without reflecting upon it, without delight in it, without being pleased by it. This valorization of use without attachment recalls the mystical experience of self-abandonment. As Fenelon had once declared of spiritual goods, one must do what one can to conserve these things, without the wish to take pleasure in them or to place them in one's heart. In a like manner, the existential stasis elaborated in the article Delicieux depends on indeterminacy and indifference, between past and future, slumber and wakefulness, being and non-being. Diderot further observes that if one could attach to this delightful quietism the idea of immutability, one would form the greatest and purest happiness that humankind could imagine. For 18th century readers, this allusion was far from innocent. Quietism referred almost exclusively to descriptions of the heretical doctrines professed by Fenelon, Guillaume, and their acolytes. That Diderot would employ so fraught a term, and in an article describing a state of altered consciousness in which the mind loses possession of itself, suggests that he did so for a specific purpose. The encyclopedia declared the philosophy to be an autonomous, wakeful, self-owning subject, and the Enlightenment a bulwark against the tide of religious excess. Diderot's contributions, however, experiment with an alternative ideal, one steeped in the language of alienation and even of quietism, that reflects upon the revelations and pure pleasures to be gained from self-loss." Unquote. Again, it is vital to understand that because the soul, or knowing, is regarded more or less as God under this framework, it leads to radical notions of equality. Everyone has a soul and is capable of thinking, therefore we are all equal with God, and all equal in general. And as we saw, the communist movements of the 20th century did in fact arise out of libertarian foundations on par with the Enlightenment. The convergence of Eckhartian Neoplatonism from speculative Masonry in the British Isles with French Masonry in the Encyclopedists occurred under Andrew Michael Ramsay, a Scottish Catholic quietist who in 1729 travelled to London and was elected to Fellowship of the Royal Society. He was initiated into Freemasonry the following year before returning to Paris, where he was then associated with Freemasonry from its introduction in France. Ramsay's being a Mason facilitated his introduction into the Gentlemen's Club of Spalding, of which the prominent Masonic propagator John Theophilus de Aguilar's was then also a member. Ramsay, being a Catholic, was responsible for introducing the Templaristic elements into Freemasonry. Additionally, like mentioned, Ramsay was a Catholic quietist, with the Quietists mostly having begun in Spain by Miguel de Molinos. Quietism is a doctrine which in general holds that perfection consists in passivity or quietness of the soul in the suppression of human effort so that divine action may have full play. Again, this passivity of the soul harkens back to Eckhart's grounding of the soul, and we saw earlier that Eckhart's Rhineland mysticism is credited with having heavily influenced the Alumbrados movement in Spain, which in turn influenced Miguel de Molinos, the originator of Quietism. Ramsay was acquainted with Quietism from Archbishop Thenlin, who had been ardently supported by the Jesuits, even though the Jesuits had earlier condemned the Quietism of Molinos. Thenlin learned of Quietism from Madame Guyon, who had read a copy of Molinos's The Spiritual Guide. J.E.S. Haywood, writing in the International Review of Social History, indeed maintains that the emphasis in early French Freemasonry was on quietist mystical theosophy. Thus is Ramsay's oration of 1737 regarded as an important development to Diderot and the Encyclopedists. To appreciate the true depth of how far these Neoplatonic Christian ideas penetrate into the modern secular world, look no further than Dinesh D'Souza's What's So Great About Christianity, Chapter 7, Created Equal, The Origin of Human Dignity, where D'Souza, who is a modern right-wing political commentator and Christian author, ironically yet accurately attributes full ownership over the egalitarian views of human equality to Christianity, and inherently to Neoplatonism, with the equality of souls being in common. D'Souza even introduces this chapter with Friedrich Nietzsche's poignant quotation from The Will to Power, another Christian concept no less crazy, the concept of equality of souls before God. This concept furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. Is it any wonder then why nearly all of the founding fathers of America were Freemasons? All men are created equal because under an Eckhartian paradigm, all men have capability for thinking and for knowing by virtue of their souls, as the Christian false religion teaches, a religion which consistently reduces to mysticism. One who is not blind to the world and its history can surely see the terrible consequences that have proceeded from this incredibly insidious equalitarian doctrine, and it is easy to deduce why communist movements have in general contained Enlightenment, aka Neoplatonist libertarian roots, embracing egalitarianism, as mentioned from Isaac Ducher and Robin Hanel. The progression from libertarianism to communism is only natural when authority is taken into account, a necessary factor in any sustainable political movement which seeks legitimacy. So based on the history presented in this section, we can roughly trace the spread of the primary idea behind Freemasonry, that is, the quietist, contemplative method with its soul ascension and of knowing as being God, to have first come from German Christian mysticism with Meister Eckhart, then through his disciples such as Jacob Baum into England with the Cambridge Platonists, in turn inspiring Isaac Newton, who impressed de Sagulars, the founder of speculative Masonry, and finally to France through de Sagulars' connection with Andrew Michael Ramsay, who was also influenced by the quietism of Archbishop Fenelon and Madame Guyon, who themselves inherited the quietism of Molinos and the Alumbrados, having come from the translated works of Eckhart and his disciples into the Spanish language. Subsequently, these ideas came to influence the encyclopedists and Masonry in France, and then the rest of mainland Europe and North America, to ultimately have its philosophy become the bedrock of the Declaration of Independence and American Constitution. Following the Eckhartian thought through the German lineage, we saw it ultimately led to Karl Marx and his socio-economic theory. On a more basic level, as the constitutions of the Freemasons read, Freemasonry follows the Catholic Christian religion, without which there would have been no soul for Eckhart to have openly theorized about. We shall now briefly mention the Neoplatonic concept of the Great Chain of Being and how it was adapted by Eckhart and incorporated into Freemasonry. In 1936, Arthur Lovejoy, eminent historian at Johns Hopkins University, published one of the most influential works in the history of ideas. The Great Chain of Being, as his book was titled, recounted the history of an idea that Lovejoy considered to be one of the half-dozen most potent and persistent presuppositions in Western thought, the most widely familiar conception of the general scheme of things, of the constitutive pattern of the universe. The principle of plenitude, that everything that can exist does exist, and everything is filled with existence. The principle of continuity, nature knows no leaps or jumps between beings, and the principle of gradation, that there is a continuous qualitative order ranging from pure matter to the perfect absolute, became the three pillars of the Neoplatonistic metaphysical system, most famously presented in the Enneads by Plotinus. Within this worldview, everything depends on a supreme and perfect one, from which all lower beings stem. In the Middle Ages, the chain was reinterpreted as Jacob's ladder, presenting a successive order of spheres that the human soul is supposed to ascend to approach God, an image that was later unified with the chain by writers such as Meister Eckhart and Reuchlin. It suffices to say that by adopting the image of the chain, Christian scholasticism built upon one of the major metaphysical pillars of ancient thinking. The renewed chain was not just a syncretic image that mashed together Greek and Christian metaphysics with deterministic mechanicism into a static enclosed ontological system. On the contrary, it became one of the most fruitful theoretical frameworks for natural philosophers during the Enlightenment, who aimed to complete the chain by seeking all those missing links between stones and plants, fish and amphibians, and even man and ape, which had not yet been found. This is from Buried Layers on the Origins, Rise, and Fall of Stratification Theories by Martin Weiser from the Sigmund Freud Private University of Berlin. In the last paragraph, we see the Darwinists' link to Neoplatonism. It is observed that Freemasons also used the Neoplatonic Great Chain of Being, later developed into Jacob's Ladder, which Eckhart transformed into simply the chain. W.L. Wilmhurst is again quoted on the soul's spiritual climax, which we know to be linked to the Eckhartian grounding or ascension of the soul. Part 3. Discourse on Gnosticism with regard to Jesuits and Freemasonry. There are two different types of Gnostics. One type, which we will call the Transcendents, focus on introspection and inner sanctity. They believe that a heavenly state can be achieved in the individual through processes of the mind. This type of Gnostic practices in one form or the other the henosis concept found in Neoplatonism, which was given further development in Eckhartian mysticism. The other type of Gnostic focuses on worldly immanentization of a heavenly state through political movements, militias, and other worldly means. This is not to say every political movement, form of activism, or warfare is Gnostic, but it depends on the nature of the heavenly state to be immanentized and whether it is an artificial one or not. Postmillennialism, as it aligns with biblical revelation, is not Gnostic. Eric Voegelin describes this distinction between the two types of Gnosticism in his Structures and Consciousness lecture. Notice that Voegelin remarks how the modern type of Gnosticism is of the immanentist variety. The roots of the immanentist form of Gnosticism are to be found in the historiographical works of 12th century Italian monk Joachim of Fiore. Voegelin says on page 179 of his Politics, Science, and Gnosticism, quote, "In his Trinitarian eschatology, Joachim created the aggregate of symbols that govern the self-interpretation of modern political society to this day." Unquote. One of the paradigms of modern political society is the Marxist paradigm. We saw in part 2 that Karl Marx's socio-economic theory had been influenced by Eckhart, but it was also influenced by Joachim of Fiore, whose prophecy of the Third Age was the inspiration for the economy of the monasteries with reference to the monastic vow of poverty, which is an express renunciation of private property later having been made a central tenet of the Communist Manifesto. For more information on the Catholic and monastic basis of communism, you can see my Rome Rules article called Karl Marx, Social Justice and Communism Are All Catholic Monastic Jesuit Creations.
According to the New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia's article on Joachim, quote, "There are three states of the world, corresponding to the three persons of the Blessed Trinity. In the first age, the Father ruled, representing power and inspiring fear, to which the Old Testament dispensation corresponds. Then the wisdom hidden through the ages was revealed in the Son, and we have the Catholic Church of the New Testament. A third period will come, the kingdom of the Holy Spirit, a new dispensation of universal love, which will proceed from the gospel of Christ, but transcend the letter of it, and in which there will be no need for disciplinary institutions." Joachim held that the second period was drawing to a close, and that the third epoch, already in part anticipated by Saint Benedict, would actually begin after some great cataclysm which he tentatively calculated would befall in 1260. Unquote. 1260 was the year that the Catholic Church officially condoned the first principle of communism, the abolishment of private property, which is the lifestyle of the monastery, the vow of poverty. Quote, "The express vow of renunciation of all private property was introduced into the profession of the Friars Minor in 1260. Joachim's theology was a general basis for communist movements. Karl Marx and Human Self-Creation by Cyril Smith states, quote, "For centuries after Joachim's death, rebels against the feudal order were describing themselves as Joachimites. Indeed, we only know of them largely because the Inquisition recorded the trial statements of these millenarians before it birthed them. Some of their ideas are still echoed in the radical writings in the 17th century England, unquote. This theology was the basis for the modern end of slavery, patriarchy, the traditional family, traditional religion, and masculinity in general, saying that Joachim's third age was to eliminate all disciplinary hierarchical institutions.
Marxism's Gnostic ideal for a collective heavenly state of absolute economic equality was to unfold and be immanentized in the manner envisioned by Joachim. Tobias Brandiner writes in Pilgrims and Popes, A Concise History of Pre-Reformation Christianity in the West, on page 221, quote, Joachim's scheme of history, as unfolding in three stages, had deep long-term influences, particularly in post-Hegelian theories of history, with Auguste Comte or Karl Marx understanding history as proceeding through three stages: theological, metaphysical, and scientific, Comte, or primitive communism, class society, and final communism, Marx. Unquote. Additionally, August Siskowski was a Polish philosopher, economist, and social and political activist, whose Hegelian philosophy influenced the young Karl Marx and action theorists. He adopted a threefold division of human history from medieval millenarians such as Joachim of Fiore and mixed it with Hegelian categories and concepts. His most important philosophical legacy is probably his influence on the young Karl Marx via German communist and young Hegelian Moses Hess. David McClellan argues that Marx, who was a friend of and collaborator with Hess from a few years from 1841 onwards, owes various aspects of his thought on alienation and the nature of and transition to communist society to Siskowski, including that the dualism between consciousness and action would collapse in revolutionary praxis. Finally, Ruth App Roberts writes in The Journal of English and Germanic Philology, Volume 88, Number 3, July 1989, pages 445 to 447, published by University of Illinois Press, under the title of Reviewed Work, Joachim of Fiore and the Myth of the Eternal Evangel in the 19th Century by Marjorie Reeves, Warwick Gould. Quote, it appears that the Joachimite Third Age and the Eternal Evangel, often very loosely understood, have been immensely influential in political ways as well as literary historical. Marx was interested and quite probably influenced. Unquote. Another paradigm of political society in modern times has been that of the Darwinian Nazi racial ideology. The collective Gnostic heavenly state of the Nazis is that of racial purity. Whereas the Marxists want an economic utopia, the Nazis have aimed to create a racial utopia. Eric Voegelin similarly maintained how the Nazi racial program, which was to be extended into a millennial reign, came from Joachim, when he wrote, quote, Hitler's millennial prophecy authentically derives from Joachitic speculation, unquote. In fact, the Third Reich was specifically named after the Third Realm or Third Age of Joachim. Quote, Arthur Moeller van der Broek, one of the most important authors of the Conservative Revolution, originally wanted to name his best-known work The Third Party. The Third Standpoint was another suggestion. The title that he ultimately chose, The Third Empire, also translated as The Third Reich, made reference to the Chiliastic view of history put forth by medieval theologian Joachim von Fiore. Unquote. The judicious assessment of Voegelin is that the monastic orders, and particularly Joachim, have been primarily responsible for modern political ideologies. Interestingly, Voegelin also mentions Freemasonry alongside renewal of the soul and spiritual perfection in his explication of political religions. He writes on pages 51 to 52 of The Political Religions, quote, the historical models that form the basis for the apocalypse of the Third Kingdom were the foundings of monastic orders, the new religions, in which the growing development of perfect life within the Holy Spirit became visible. The first generations of the Franciscans condensed the revelation into the belief that Francis of Assisi was the prophesied dux, with Joachim of Fiore and Dominic being the forerunners. The work of Joachim was acknowledged as the Evangelium Aeternum of the Apocalypse, Revelation 14:6. The Third Empire of Joachim is not a new institution that was to take the place of the Church, but a process of spiritualization of the ecclesia and transformation of the universal Church toward a new contemplative and spiritual monastic order. Contrary Paul's imperial apocalypse, the revelation of Joachim of Fiore, therefore, contains no references to the social order of the Third Empire. In the empire of the spiritualist intelligentsia, the people would lead contemplative lives, i.e., no longer active contemplative like the clergy of the universal Church. They would live spiritually in poverty and fraternally, all would have equal rank, and there would be no coercive order. The Christian apocalypse of the empire and the symbolism of the late Middle Ages form the historical basis for the apocalyptic dynamics in modern political religions. As a result of the Christian monastic movements since Benedict, and above all, the development of mendicant orders, as well as the formation of new religions within Christianity, the spiritual view of the renewal of the soul, and the partaking in the perfection of the Christian ideal of existence are considered part of this world. The rising line of perfection of spiritual being has become one of the strongest elements of interworldly dynamics since the Renaissance. In the belief in the perfectibilitas of human reason, in the infinite further development of humankind to an ideal final condition during the Enlightenment, in the deistic formations of orders of Freemasonry to perfect the world structure, and in the belief in progress as the religion of the people in the 19th century. The symbolism of the apocalypse of the empires lives on in the symbolism of the 19th century and 20th centuries, in the three empires of Marx and Engels' philosophy of history, in the Third Reich of National Socialism, and in the fascist Third Rome, following the Rome of antiquity and the Christian Rome. Also, the content-related definitions of the Third Empire have remained intact. The belief that the institution of the universal Church will be dissolved through spiritualization into orders of perfect life through the descent of the Holy Spirit, in the belief in the withering away of the state, in the fraternal and free association of people in the communist Third Rome, in the belief in the deliverers of the empire, Dante's 500, 5 and 10, in the figures and myths of leaders in our time, and in the orders of the new empires in the communist, fascist, and national socialist associations and elite groupings as the core of the new imperial organizations." Unquote. According to American anthropologist Anthony Avini in his book Apocalyptic Anxiety, Religion Science, and America's Obsession with the End, the Freemasons' Age of Enlightenment is drawing inspiration from Joachim's Third Age. He writes on page 66 of his work, quote, "The early 18th century English transplant version of Freemasonry connected Freemasons' lodges or clubs with the building trade in the form of the medieval guilds of Masons who had built the great cathedrals, thereby achieving high social status. The raising of a temple to glorify God had its parallel in human development, wherein the improvement of the body and mind was thought to build a more durable temple for the soul. Freemasons regarded their collective as speculative societies, an invisible college of specially qualified adepts who, drawing from the philosophy of Joachim of Fiore, sought from their learning the prophetic pathway to the dawn of a new age of enlightenment." Unquote. Avini's statement about the parallels within Freemasonry of the building of a temple to first provide a housing for the soul does well to introduce the true endgame of the elites. It is no secret that the Freemasons have always been involved with engineering and technology. As we studied in Part 2, Freemasonry teaches the ascension of the soul through contemplation. But how are we to live our lives as contemplative monastic lunatics if we need to constantly take care of ourselves and our families, tend to our day-to-day work, and go about our lives? This is where the technocratic society comes in. Freemasons are actively seeking to innovate ways in which humans can bypass reality, making life as convenient as possible so we can dedicate our lives to mysticism and nonsense, robbing us of fulfilling what Ted Kaczynski referred to as our power process. A mere temple now is not sufficient for the soul's housing, but rather artificial appendages, robots, microchips, and a whole myriad of technological devices are to be our temple. Modern technology is the new monkish garb designed identically to ease one's transcendence. Sociologist Kingsley L. Dennis writes in The Sacred Revival, Magic, Mind, and Meaning in a Technological Age about Freemasons and transcendence through technology, quote, "The spirit of discovery infused the beginnings of the Royal Society of London, which was founded in 1663 from the more secretive Invisible College. The Royal Society devoted their resources to many areas of technology, including navigation instruments, ship construction, mining, metallurgy, military instruments, and energy devices. Behind the Royal Society flowed a deep occult river of alchemy that embodied the ideal of the transcendent knower in quest of the transcendent God. According to historian Francis Yates, in the 1720s, 1 out of every 4 English Freemasons was a Fellow of the Royal Society. A technologically inspired zeitgeist also flowed through the veins of Freemasonry, which dedicated itself to the useful arts of mechanical invention in the pursuit of a grander human development. Many great technological innovators and engineers came from the ranks of Freemasonry. Among the earliest civil engineers in England was John de Sagulars, 3rd Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge of England. This spirit of innovation also flowed strongly overseas through prominent U.S. Masons such as Benjamin Franklin. The École Polytechnique in France became one of the world's premier engineering schools and was created by a group of Freemasons. Freemasons were the apostles of the religion of technology with ideals of technological transcendence." Unquote. We mustn't forget, though, the most powerful group in the New World Order, the Jesuit Order, and their status as being the ultimate Joachimites. As Southern Israelite has shown from the secret instructions of the Jesuits view themselves as Joachim's prophesied order of the just, those who will usher in and rule in the coming Third Age. It has been said by some that the secret instructions were a forgery. However, scholarship is on our side regarding the Jesuits and Joachim. E. Randolph Daniel of the University of Kentucky, in his review of the book Joachim of Fiore and the Prophetic Future by Marjorie Reeves, says, quote, "Jesuits believed that Joachim had prophesied the coming of the society. Benito Pereira, S.J., used Joachim's thinking in his commentary on the Apocalypse, and Joachim influenced Guillaume Postel, who was also a Jesuit." Unquote. Much could be said regarding the Jesuit infiltration of Freemasonry. It is believed that the Jesuits wrote the first 25 degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry in their College of Claremont. This theory is not without its opponents. However, their criticism cannot dismiss the other pertinent historical writings wherein the Jesuits are said to have been involved with the development and promotion of Freemasonry. British physicist and mathematician John Robison wrote in his Proofs of a Conspiracy, published in 1797, quote, "The Jesuits interfered considerably, insinuating themselves into the lodges and contributing to increase that religious mysticism that is to be observed in all the ceremonies of the order." Unquote. Also in A History of Political and Religious Persecutions by Fernando Garrido and Charles Babbage Cayley, Volume 2, page 334, quote, "In the Russian Empire, the Emperor Paul first prohibited Freemasonry in 1797. The Jesuits, who had returned to the country in 1802, procured a revocation of this edict." Unquote. Remember too how we saw that the Russian Freemasonic lodges were confirmed to have been highly infused with the Eckartian mysticism of Jacob Baum, the same sort of mysticism which was at times supported, as with Fenelon, and at times condemned, as with Molinos, by the Jesuits. So the Jesuits are obviously intimately familiar with the type of mysticism inherent to Freemasonry, and they have had reason to promulgate it for the purpose of initiating the Joachitic, communistic, and mystic technocratic age of the spirit. One Jesuit in particular, who is of extreme importance to the technocratic elites, and who represents the methodology that the Jesuits are employing to implement their Third Age technocracy, is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who lived from the late 19th to mid-20th century. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a major player in the globalist power structure, was an ardent student of Chardin. Brzezinski, a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, wrote the book Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era, wherein he laid out the blueprint for the technological control structure. Chardin held a particularly accentuated view of mysticism in comparison with other Jesuits of his time. It is the opinion of this video's producer that the Jesuits typically condemned the mysticism of the transcendent Gnostics because it had historically not been aligned with their earlier goals, which were to refute the Reformed doctrine through traditional Catholic apologetics and extend the Pope's feudal rule over the temporal realm. This all changed with the takeover of the Church by the Jesuits in 1814. And after their military and political work had been done in defeating the troublesome monarchs and diluting and infiltrating Protestant nations, it was now time to unleash the metaphysically inclined New World Order inspired by Joachim, and Teilhard de Chardin was the forerunner of this scheme. Chardin stressed that disattachment from reality is the necessary method for, quote, developing and completing the world, unquote. Chardin taught disattachment, yet believed that worldly action was necessary to facilitate such a universal state of severing with the material world. In so doing, Chardin merges the Neoplatonic thought found in Eckartian mysticism with Joachitic immanentization. Following after Chardin, the Jesuits seek to Gnostically immanentize a Gnostic transcendent social order, in accordance with the exact prophecy of Joachim and the Jesuits, who view themselves as Joachim's Order of the Just, as opposed to Marxists or Nazis who transposed Joachim's prophecy into strictly economic or racial Third Ages, respectively, though the former was closer in resemblance to Joachim's Third Age. To reiterate, like the spiritual Franciscans before them, the Jesuits are conspiring to fulfill Joachim's prophecy in exact terms. The Freemasons share the same goals as the Jesuits, in creating technology for man to transcend reality, and like the Jesuits, the Freemasons have been inspired by the future utopian vision of Joachim's Third Age.
Enter the atheist capitalist 20th century and the rise of the capitalist technocracy. Warnings were heralded by works such as H.G. Wells' Things to Come, Metropolis, and the feminist movement itself, which all were pointing out the problems that the Industrial Revolution was causing, such as the end of the organic communities and the creation of the bustling cities, where traditional families and religious structure was destroyed. Men worked unfulfilling, toxic, and monotonous factory jobs for robber baron industrialists who treated them like disposable Coke cans after their youth, and health was used up in their factories, breaking their backs as wage slaves to enrich men who hated the human race and were generally unconcerned about giving back to the local communities. Women were left at home alone with no other adults, seeing the traditional families and communities were destroyed by the modern suburban cities, living lonely and unfulfilling lives. Life in the new cities was not what they thought it would be. Having a little more money in their pockets did not counterbalance the loss of their religions, their communities, their families, i.e. their reason for being. Yet the atheist capitalists found a way to quarterback their growing technocracy. We will fill the now empty lives of wage slaves with entertainment technology. We will give them games, television, radio, basketball, and football. This will be the new religion of our atheist civilization. Yet the Jesuit Order had other plans for the emerging technology. Enter Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin and his development of transhumanist philosophy. Not only has the Catholic religion focused man's attention on an abstract metaphysical upper world, very similar to the virtual reality of today's video game culture, rather than the physical earth we live on, the Catholic religion has always maintained its deranged unnatural theology by misrepresenting the use of the word flesh or sars in the Greek of the New Testament, of the writings of the Apostle Paul, and maintaining that the natural desires of the human body as being the primary barrier between man and God. No surprise this exact theology was identified by Paul in 1 Timothy 4 as being the identifying marks of the coming Antichrist religion. Thus, Deschardins maintained that man could transcend his sinful body by merging with technology. This is exactly what is happening today. The modern man is lost in a digital fantasy world of pornography and video games, and has almost completely abandoned the notion of a traditional family. Just like a good monk, he spends his days alone, impoverished, mentally masturbating to an abstract fantasy world in his domicile. And I can tell you from personal experience, if you try to help one of these young men, try to further his work, his career, help him get a better job so he can make more money, all hell will break loose against you. Now you may be thinking to yourself, yeah man, that has happened and I get where you're going with this, but how in the world do the Jesuits expect the human race to abandon natural sexual relations altogether and become celibate monks? That just sounds asinine. Enter the coronavirus. Now, Aldous Huxley had predicted in his massively influential Brave New World that the future globalist technocracy would include regular casual sex relations between its citizens who engage in an atheistic club-hopping scene of unending sexual promiscuity. Yet again, the men really in power have other plans. In 1993, the movie Demolition Man gave the most accurate depiction of the near-to-be future. In this movie, there is a scene where the sexual mores of the coming technocracy are explained. Sandra Bullock's character, after proposing virtual sex to Sylvester Stallone's character, explains why sex is no longer done through physical penetration, and even kissing is prohibited.
Conclusions and overview. Number 1. The rule of the Freemasons in governing their lodges was borrowed from the rule of Benedict of Nursia for structuring monastic life. The Peterstone's article also cited how there were numerous monastic lodges established in Europe in the 18th century, with hundreds of monks and clergymen having been Freemasons. This relationship even helped secure the preservation of monasteries in France during the Revolution. And this arrangement was made possible because of the monastics and Freemasons sharing the same philosophy, that is, Neoplatonism. Number 2. The Freemasons and other Illuminist sects believe in soul mysticism, which was further developed from the Neoplatonic Christian soul doctrine by Dominican monk Meister Eckhart into an autotheistic and pantheistic conception of God as knowing, where disattachment is a necessary component for such episodes of contemplative unity. The ethical implications of this mentality are forms of radical egalitarianism. Number 3. There is a harmonious relationship to be found between the Freemasons and the Jesuits with respect to a plan for a New World religion consisting of teachings and practices neither found directly in the Bible nor which are able to be exegeted from it, but rather of those teachings and practices having their origin with Neoplatonism in the West and which form the basis of the Christian religion, having later been expanded by Eckhart and transmitted to the secularist Freemasons, leading nations into mental captivity and self-destruction. These are the teachings and practices which the Jesuits and Freemasons aspire to universally implement, abetted by technology produced by satanic Darwinian capitalists, many Freemasons themselves, who wouldn't dare cross the Jesuit Order. If the kings of Europe were taken out by them, what big deal is a venture capitalist or entrepreneur? The people must transcend, and if they don't know how to, we will provide the means through technology. Joachim also maintained that the final era of existence would not come about before the world had been converted to the Catholic religion. Once it is understood that Christianity is Neoplatonism, and that also Islam and Judaism have long been strongly disposed to Neoplatonic interpretation and comprehension, sharing much with Eastern religious thought, it is clear to see why there is such an ecumenical attraction within Freemasonry and Eckhartian Christian mysticism. The Jesuit-controlled Catholic Church is the acknowledged leader of the ecumenical movement. The New World religion is to be Catholic. This video would not have been possible without the work of the Southern Israelite, from whom I learned of the pervasivity of Neoplatonic philosophy, as well as it being the root of the Christian religion, the prophecy of Joachim, among much other important information and a broad range of philosophical, theological, and political topics. I would encourage the viewer to subscribe to his social media and to support his platform. Links in the description.